The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Sikiari.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, since the submission of the Secretary General's written report on Security Council Resolution 2334, hostilities and violence have continued throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. In the Gaza Strip, hostilities between Israel Defense Forces and Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups, including heavily Israeli bombardments through the Strip, have resulted in heavy casualties. In the occupied West Bank, high levels of violence persist amid ongoing Israeli operations, exchanges with armed Palestinians, settler-related violence, and Palestinian attacks against Israel. Among other deadly strikes in Gaza from 14 to 15 December, at least 69 Palestinians, including women and children, were reportedly killed in 4 Israeli strikes on schools sheltering IDPs in Gaza City, Beit Hanun, and Khan Yunis, including 20 killed in an airstrike hitting an UNRWA school in Al-Mawazi, Khan Yunis. The Israel Defense Forces say they were targeting Hamas militants. More than 250 Palestinians have been killed in such strikes in Gaza over the past week, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. The death toll of this war continues to mount. Since October 7, 2023, more than 45,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, according to the Ministry of Health, and over 1,700 Israeli and foreign nationals have been killed in attacks in or originating from Gaza, according to Israeli sources. In the occupied West Bank, on 12 December, an Israeli boy was killed in a shooting attack on a bus near the A1 Qadr junction in the occupied West Bank, south of Jerusalem. Israeli authorities say that the Palestinian perpetrator later turned himself in. The same day, Israeli forces reportedly killed a Palestinian man in an exchange of fire in Balata refugee camp near Nablus. Serious clashes have also taken place between Palestinian armed groups in the occupied West Bank and Palestinian security forces since the written report, particularly in Jenin camp following a Palestinian arrest operation and the seizure of Palestinian Authority vehicles by militants. Over several days, Palestinian security forces have killed an unarmed 19-year-old and detained numerous Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants, while the clashes have caused significant damage to the camp. Madam President, I will now highlight some of the Secretary General's observations regarding the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. I once again strongly condemn the horrific attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7 October 2023 and the continued holding of more than 100 hostages in Gaza. Nothing can justify these acts of terror. All remaining hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. I remain appalled that there are reasonable grounds to believe that hostages may be subject to ongoing sexual violence and abuse. While in captivity, hostages must be treated humanly and allowed to receive visits and assistance from the Red Cross. I reiterate that there is no justification for the deliberate killing, maiming, torture, and abduction of civilians and other protected persons, nor using sexual violence against them. The use of human shields and the firing of indiscriminate rockets toward Israel population centers are violations of international humanitarian law and must cease. Turning to the situation in Gaza, a ceasefire is long overdue. The continued collective punishment of the Palestinian people is unjustifiable. The relentless bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces, the larger number of civilian casualties, the blanket destruction of Palestinian neighborhoods, and the worsening humanitarian situation are horrific. The widespread devastation and deprivation resulting from Israel's military operations in North Gaza, especially around Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun, are making the conditions of life untenable for the Palestinian population there. I condemn Israel's use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in densely populated area that has caused massive casualties and damage to residential buildings, schools, hospitals, mosques, and UN premises. United Nations premises are inviolable in all times. I reiterate my unequivocal condemnation of the widespread killing and injury of civilians in Gaza, including women and children, and the deprivation of essentials to survive. I'm concerned over what may amount to violations of international humanitarian law in the conduct of hostilities, including non-compliance with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attacks and against the effect of attacks. The international humanitarian law always applies to all parties to a conflict, and its application does not depend on reciprocity. The protection of civilians is paramount. There must be full accountability for any atrocity crimes that have been committed. I mourn the United Nations personnel killed in Gaza and strongly condemn the killing of all health and humanitarian personnel and journalists. I also condemn the looting of aid in the context of a breakdown of law and order. These are unacceptable and must stop immediately. I reiterate my call for the full investigation of all such incidents and accountability for any violation of international law. Due to continued restrictions imposed by Israel, looting by armed Palestinians, and overall insecurity, supplies have entered Gaza at levels that are inadequate to meet the overwhelming needs of the population, including large numbers of IDPs living in extremely overcrowded conditions. To address the needs, the United Nations and its partners urgently require the predictable entry and unimpeded movement of food, shelter materials, medicine and fuel, and the capacity to repair essential life-saving infrastructure, including the healthcare system. Noting its opening of additional entry points for humanitarian aid, I call upon Israel to fulfill its obligation as occupying power under international law, including allowing and facilitating rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need into and throughout Gaza, and to create the conditions that will permit the return of Palestinians to their homes. I know the relative success of the polio vaccination campaign. While falling short of our targets in the north of Gaza, the use of tactical pauses and examples of functioning coordination with Israel demonstrated what is possible and achievable. I reiterate my call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in Gaza. The United Nations is continuously engaged with all stakeholders toward these objectives and stands ready to support the implementation of an agreement. I welcome the continued efforts, including by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to overcome the significant obstacles and reach a deal. I remain deeply alarmed by the relentless Israeli settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that is fueling tensions, impeding access by Palestinians to their land, and threatening the viability of a future independent, democratic, contiguous, and sovereign Palestinian state. I reiterate that all Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have no legal validity and are in flagrant violation of international law and United Nations resolutions. I'm deeply concerned that over the past year, the government of Israel has continued to systematically promote policies that have strengthened the involvement of civilian officials in control over the occupied West Bank, including transferring some security functions to civilian control, while some government officials called for the annexation of areas in the occupied West Bank. I urge the government of Israel to cease all settlement activities immediately. I note in this regard the recent findings by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, which declared inter alia that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must end as rapidly as possible. The demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures, including internationally funded humanitarian projects, as well as structures related to income generation and the provision of essential services, entail numerous violations of international law and raise concerns about the risk of forcible transfer. I once again call upon the government of Israel to end this practice and to prevent the displacement of Palestinians in accordance with its international obligations under international law, and to approve plans to allow Palestinians to build legally and address their development needs. The escalating violence and tensions in the occupied West Bank are highly concerning and could trigger broader explosion. Intensified operations by Israeli forces, increased settler violence and attacks against Israeli have also exacerbated tensions and led to exceedingly high levels of casualties, detentions, and destruction. I'm alarmed by the little attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, including sometimes in proximity and with the support of Israeli security forces, and by Palestinians against Israelis. All perpetrators of attacks must be held accountable. I reiterate that Israeli security forces in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, must exercise maximum restraint and use lethal forces only when it is strictly unavoidable to protect life. I call on Israel to abide by its obligations under international law and to ensure thorough, independent, and prompt investigation into all instances of possible excessive use of force, holding those responsible to account. I'm particularly appalled that children continue to be victims of violence on all sides. I'm also concerned that Palestinian children continue to be arrested in large numbers and held for prolonged periods of time, including in administrative detention. I reiterate my call for Israel to use detention as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period to prevent all forms of ill treatment in detention and to end the administrative detention of children who are entitled to special protections. I'm disturbed at the numerous instances during the reporting period in which officials glorified violence and engaged in dangerous provocations, incitement, and inflammatory language, which will only lead to greater polarization and risks further bloodshed. Leaders have an obligation to clearly and explicitly condemn acts of terror and violence directed against civilians. The incitement to violence must stop immediately. I reiterate my call to the parties for the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem to be respected and upheld, taking into account the special and historic role Kingdom of Jordan as custodian of the holy site in Jerusalem. I'm deeply concerned with the adoption of the Knesset of Israel of 2 laws concerning UNRWA. These laws, if implemented, could prevent UNRWA from continuing its essential work in the occupied Palestinian territory, which would have devastating consequences for Palestine refugees, considering that there is no viable alternative to UNRWA which could adequately meet the needs. I again urge Israel to act consistently with its obligation under the Charter of United Nations and its other obligations under international law, including under international humanitarian law and those concerning privileges and immunities of the United Nations. National legislation cannot alter those obligations. Madam President, it is vital that the international community provide immediate support to the Palestinian government to address its fiscal challenges, strengthen its governance capacity, and prepare it to reassume its responsibilities in Gaza. We must establish political and security frameworks that can address the humanitarian catastrophe, start early recovery, rebuild Gaza, and lay the groundwork for a political process to end the occupation and establish a viable two-state solution as soon as possible. It is vital that these frameworks facilitate a legitimate Palestinian government that can reunify Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, politically, economically, and administratively, while reversing the steadily deteriorating dynamics throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. Any attempt to establish settlements in Gaza must be firmly rejected. There must be no attempt to reduce or annex the territory of Gaza in whole or in part. The devastations and misery of the past year have reinforced once again a simple truth. Palestinians and Israelis can no longer wait to establish a viable political horizon. Now is the time to lay the foundations for a better future for Palestinian, Israeli, and the broader region. Israeli, Palestinian, the states of the region, and the broader international community must urgently take steps that will enable the parties to re-engage on the long-delayed political path to achieve two-state solution. The United Nations remains committed to supporting Palestinian and Israelis in ending the occupation and resolving the conflict in line with international law, relevant United Nations resolution, and bilateral agreements in pursuit of the vision of two-state, Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Shira Efron.
Thank you, Madam President, and distinguished members of the Security Council for the invitation to brief the Council today. It is truly an honor. Especially at the United Nations, the birthplace of the plan to partition mandated Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, it is pertinent to acknowledge that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a tragedy today for both Jews and Arabs. At the same time, it is also crucial to recognize, as the General Assembly did back then, that practical solutions exist and should be pursued. As an Israeli Jew, I speak from my lived reality. The trauma in Israel is palpable, with society still frozen in the horror of October 7, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. On that day, Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists murdered over 1,200 Israelis and nationals of other countries, abducted 251, and committed atrocities, including large-scale sexual violence. Today, 439 days later, 100 people, including soon-to-be a 2-year-old toddler and an 86-year-old grandfather, remain in captivity in Gaza, while their families, as you'll hear in just a few minutes, endure daily torment. We are all praying for their immediate release. Border communities bear the scars of destruction and displacement. Israelis continue to face insecurity with ongoing bombardments from multiple fronts and terror attacks on our streets. In Gaza, devastation is unimaginable. Countless lives lost, families shattered, including of my dear friends Khalil and Ahmed. Homes reduced to rubble, and populations struggling for survival with scarce basic necessities like food, water, and healthcare. The West Bank, meanwhile, is gripped by rising violence and economic hardship. For both societies, the wounds of this war are deep and will take years to heal. Yet, even now, steps can be taken to halt the suffering and begin charting a path towards stability and hope for both Israelis and Palestinians. Madam President, the collective challenge before us as Israelis, Palestinians, countries of the Middle East, and the international community is to seize this moment of profound tragedy and turn it into a bold diplomatic process that leads to peace, security, and prosperity for people across the region. While international actors frequently invoke the language of a two-state solution with goodwill and intent, reliance on mere sloganeering and rhetoric has done little to build trust or address the structural dynamics of the conflict. And while we at Israel Policy Forum also view the two-state option as the only viable framework that acknowledges the legitimate national aspirations of both sides, and is the only way to guarantee the future that Israel's founders envisioned, a Jewish, democratic, and secure state of Israel, we realize that two-state reality will remain only a vision unless we change our approach. What is needed now is a coherent, inclusive, and actionable strategy that moves beyond rigid thinking so that we can end the war, stabilize Gaza, and shift trends in the West Bank from creeping annexation to peaceful separation. Regional actors should leverage the potential for normalization with Israel to empower pragmatic actors while countering spoilers. This moment demands a shift from platitudes to planning, with a coordinated roadmap that addresses security and governance, delivers tangible short-term wins, and lays the foundation for our shared long-term vision. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the discussions about the day after in Gaza. Madam President, as we anxiously hold our breath for a hostage and ceasefire agreement, there is still no shared coherent plan for post-war Gaza. The international community sees basically one viable path out of this morass: establishing a transitional non-Hamas Palestinian administration in Gaza with the aim of eventually restoring full Palestinian PA governance once it is reformed and strengthened. Clearly, without a green light from the PA, regional and other international partners will not commit to Gaza's recovery. Yet, mostly for political reasons, whether we like it or not, the Israeli government has until now vetoed PA involvement, exacerbating the risk of either full Israeli occupation of Gaza or a Hamas resurgence, or both. Notably, this forum, it's important to acknowledge that despite extreme voices, most Israelis do not want to control the Palestinians in perpetuity, but they're scared and see no plausible alternative. To soften Israeli resistance, there is a need for a gradual, benchmark-driven approach with assurances that capitalizes on success stories, even if those are small. Existing PA capacity in Gaza can and should be mobilized for the humanitarian effort, for example, through relying on former security personnel and senior representatives in key government positions, including in the monetary and water authorities, with whom Israel already interacts today. Involving the PA and ensuring it has the capacities to succeed would also help alleviate fiscal and economic pressures in the West Bank, which is a deep concern for the Israeli security establishment. It would also incentivize sustained, more strategic donor engagement and enlist regional Middle East partners in restoring public order in Gaza's chaos. Further, consent for a meaningful PA role in Gaza should be explicitly leveraged to propel genuine PA reforms with clear objectives, a defined roadmap, and key performance indicators. The PA should demonstrate that it can really be part of the solution by reforming the so-called prisoner and martyr payment systems, creating a conducive environment for the private sector, strengthening judicial independence, reorganizing the security sector, addressing incitement, undertaking educational reform, and working toward a credible election horizon that allows for political participation of next-gen leadership. Without these reforms, realistically, Israel will continue to withhold tax revenues from the PA. US restrictions on aid will remain, and regional states will be hesitant to invest in the Palestinian economy and infrastructure, which will further deepen the PA's fiscal crisis and legitimacy crisis and jeopardize stability both in the West Bank and Gaza. For its own long-term interest and to enable the PA to succeed, Israel must also take critical steps to shift its policy in Gaza and in the West Bank. These include easing financial pressures on the PA, allowing it to the operational space to effectively govern and secure the territory under its jurisdiction, to free settlement expansions in areas that undermine territorial separation, and in those only, and taking decisive action to stop settler violence. US leadership, security guarantees, and Arab-Israeli normalization can and should play a key role in driving these measures forward. There are no quick fixes to these long-standing issues, unfortunately, and the situation on the ground cannot wait for all our clocks to synchronize. Yet Israel and the international community should identify and amplify positive signals, such as Israel's decision to extend the indemnification for correspondent banking between Israel and the West Bank, as well as the current efforts by the Palestinian security forces to regain control of the refugee camp in the town of Jenin. Importantly, this initiative, alongside ongoing security cooperation and coordination between Israel and the Palestinians, even in the past 15 months, is the result of a long-term strategic international investment in the U.S. Security Coordinator, or the USSC. Building on such success stories is essential to both strengthen and improve the PA's capacity while simultaneously alleviating Israel's legitimate security concerns. Madam President, so much depends on Israelis, Palestinians, the support of member states, and especially US leadership. But the UN, as an institution, has an integral role to play as well. Effective UN capacity is necessary for the humanitarian response, for recovery and reconstruction, for stabilization, and for assisting the Palestinian state in the making, indeed, and not only in word. Internally, this requires tight coordination across UN agencies and between principles, streamlined funding, operational mechanisms, and strategic flexibility to step back from overly rigid approaches when pragmatism is needed. At the same time, the UN and Israel must repair their fractured relationship, which has reached unprecedented low. Both sides have legitimate grievances, but there is too much at stake to allow them to get in the way of efficient and forward-looking cooperation that is in both sides' interests. I will speak about the Israeli perspective. There is a long-standing sense of UN bias, compounded by what Israel sees as insufficient reaction to October 7 and its aftermath, and the evidence of UNRWA staff ties to Hamas. This trust deficit has real policy shortcomings of losing all support and leverage with Israel. Israelis need to hear an unequivocal UN condemnation of Hamas and its actions. And like the Palestinians, Israelis also need an international reaffirmation of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in a state of their own and acknowledgement of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Neither side will be partners in a political process that we both need if that process denies the legitimacy of these rights. To conclude, just as it did when it passed the partition plan in 1947, the UN has an important role to play in helping Israelis and Palestinians move beyond what has been the darkest period in their shared history. This can happen by zooming in on what is possible and achievable rather than what is perfect, and focusing on the solutions rather than getting stuck on the problems. Thank you, Madam President and members of the Security Council.
I thank Ms. Efren for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Michael Levy.
Thank you, Madam President, and distinguished members of the UN Security Council. Today, I stand before you not just as Michael Levy, but as a brother, a son, a human being, and as someone whose life has been shattered by unimaginable loss and despair. My brother, Or Levy, is one of the 100 innocent hostages currently held by Hamas in Gaza. For 439 days, Or has been missing from our family. 439 days of fear, anguish, and an unbearable silence that echoes louder than any words ever could. On October 7th, Or and his wife Einaf went to a music festival, seeking for a brief moment of joy. They arrived just 9 minutes before all hell broke loose. Missiles flew over their heads, and they had to run into a nearby shelter, thinking they will be safe. From that shelter, Or called my mother, repeating the terrifying words, "Mom, you don't want to know what's going on here." That was the last time we heard his voice. 10 minutes later, Hamas terrorists stormed the shelter. They threw grenades, sprayed bullets, murdered Einaf, and kidnapped Or into the tunnels of Gaza. The last image we have of him is heartbreaking, covered in his wife's blood, shocked and terrified. Or is more than just a number. He is a real human being, a father to an amazing 3-year-old son named Almog, who lost his mother in the horrendous terror attack of October 7th, and is now essentially orphaned. This baby had to celebrate his 3rd birthday without his parents. Try to imagine your own child celebrating his birthday without you, going through life's milestones without you. Imagine not knowing if your child is okay and who is taking care of him. Almog keeps asking about mom and dad, and even when we try to explain, he doesn't understand why he can't see his dad, and what it means when we say that mom will never come back. This baby still has a father who can come back to him. Do not let him become an orphan. You have the power to save his father. For 439 days, I've woken up every morning with a pit in my stomach, wondering where my brother is, wondering if he's cold, if he's hungry, if he managed to survive another day. Every moment he remains in captivity is a moment of unbearable suffering for him and for all of us who love him. I'm here today to remind this council and the world of its duty, not just as diplomats, but as people, as mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends, because this is not merely a political issue. This is a human issue, a moral issue. I want to ask every member of this council, what would you do if it was your child, your brother, your loved one? Hamas's actions are not just blatant violation of international law. They are an assault on humanity itself. Holding civilians hostage, men, women, children, is a violation of the principles that this very council was created to protect. And yet, your silence is deafening. Your inaction is suffocating. For every day this council fails to act, the message to the world is clear. that some lives are worth saving and others are not. But I refuse to accept that message. I refuse to accept a world where my brother's life can be used as a bargaining chip and be forgotten. I refuse to believe that this council, which was created to uphold the highest ideals of humanity, will turn its back on those who need it the most. This is your moment to act, to lead, to show the world that this council has the courage to stand for what is right and send a resonating message that terror will never prevail. I'm asking you to prove that international law means something, that human rights are not just words, but principles you will fight to protect. Demand the release of all, demand the release of them all. These 100 lives are not just numbers. They are fathers, mothers, daughters, sons, brothers and sisters. They are people with families waiting desperately to hold them again. I want to express my deepest gratitude to the American nation and all the rest of the nation that supported our campaign for standing with us in this dark hour. Your unwavering belief in freedom and justice is a beacon of hope for families like mine who are desperate for a lifeline. And to President Trump and Biden, we place our deepest hopes and faith that you will bring this tragedy to an end. Your decisive leadership has already brought light into a situation that feels so hopeless. We believe in your strength, your leadership, and your commitment to justice to help bring our loved ones back home. I want to finish with a personal note. Today is my birthday, the second birthday I mentioned without my baby brother. I'm not asking for any presents, celebrations, or even a cake. My only birthday wish is sitting in a Hamas tunnel waiting to be brought back to his son. Bring my brother home. Bring them all home. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Levy for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements.